Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is also known as CTE. It's something that has really come to light in the past 10 or 15 years in the sports world, particularly with the NFL and different lawsuits that have been filed against the NFL. So, what we're going to look at are some of the changes in sports, both over time in decades as well as in increasing levels of difficulty and skill. We're going to look at what CT is, who gets it, and how they get it. We'll look at signs and symptoms of CTE while people are living. And then we'll look at the autopsy process and the changes that are found during autopsy. That's where we'll stop for this screencast, but then we will also look at current trends in CTE research as well as case studies of athletes with CTE. So the first thing to understand are the physics behind sports. There are a lot of different collisions that may occur in sports, whether on purpose as part of the game or accidentally just during the normal course of play. One thing to note is that athletes are bigger. They have more mass. So athletes have gotten bigger over time throughout the decades, as well as you go from, say, Pee Wee football to high school football to college football to the NFL. Size increases. The speed of sports, the speed of the game, also increases. With more size and more speed, you generate more force. These forces, again, can occur on purpose or just as normal gameplay. And they are not always in a straight line or linear. Most of the time, forces in sports in real time have a rotational component. They're not quite on center, but they're a little bit off center. And these rotational forces actually are greater and put more strain on the tissue than a linear force would. These forces, additionally, are not absorbed by a helmet in a game where a helmet or other type of headgear is being worn. Because a helmet is on the outside of the head, it does a great job of absorbing forces on the outside of the skull. This helps prevent injuries like skull fractures. However, the helmet doesn't do a good job of stopping movement within the skull, and it's the movement within the skull that's causing damage to the brain. So what exactly is CTE? It is a degenerative brain change or a series of changes that occur within your brain. If we break down what chronic traumatic encephalopathy is, chronic means over time, traumatic means caused by force, encephalo means within the brain, and pathy means something's wrong, so sickness, illness, injury. So it's actually a disease of the brain caused over time by force. When we look about 100 years ago, CTE was first described as something called punch-drunk syndrome. In the 1930s, we saw similar findings in alcoholics as well as boxers, but we couldn't really confirm these changes. It looked like they were having an early onset of dementia, and it was mostly in boxers, which is why it was called dementia pugilistica. A pugilist is a boxer or a fighter. That continued for decades until 2005 when Dr. Bennett Amalu up in Boston diagnosed the first case of CTE in a former NFL player. Since that time, we've had hundreds of cases of CTE, most of these in athletes, most of them in former NFL players. So what actually causes CTE? So CTE, these degenerative brain changes, are caused by repetitive subconcussive blows to the head. So this means that subconcussive, they may not be showing symptoms, they may never have a concussion. Often, if someone is using their head and hitting again and again and again for years, they will have concussions along the way. But currently, there is no empirical or research-backed link between concussion and CTE. So that might be a little problem with Will Smith's movie called Concussion. It could have been called something else, perhaps. That's a personal gripe. It could have been called death by NFL or football kills, but calling it concussion might not have been appropriate because the hits that cause CTE are often these repetitive, subconcussive, low level hits that occur from just hitting your head again and again and again against other players, the ground, whatever it might be. So when we look at who gets CTE, it's been found in a bunch of different groups. The ones that we'll focus on are boxers, football players, soccer players, ice hockey players. They get it usually from hits directly to the head. These are obviously not just contact sports, but collision sports in the cases of all but soccer. However, in soccer, you're also repetitively using your head with headers. Military veterans and victims of domestic abuse can also see this from hits to the head. Military veterans, especially from blast injuries sustained during combat. Most of what we're looking at, though, are in these contact collision athletes. So some of the signs and symptoms of CTE, they're very similar later in life to dementia. And so things that would normally be onset in your 70s or your 80s, you're seeing much, much sooner. So with CTE, a lot of times you'll begin to see the symptoms in the late 20s or early 30s. The first symptoms that occur are mood and behavioral changes. So these are things like aggressive or impulsive behavior, depression, suicidal thoughts or behavior. Most people, I don't know the number, but many of the people that die that have CTE do die due to suicide. They are irritable. They're emotionally unstable. A lot of times this will come with substance abuse problems or with paranoia. So these mood and behavioral changes are what begin to occur first. These occur in the late 20s and into someone's 30s. Then you have the thinking and memory or cognitive changes. These are the changes that you start to see usually in someone's 40s and 50s. And again, this early onset of dementia in the 40s or 50s, in your 40s or 50s is not normal. These are things that would normally occur decades later in life with quote unquote regular dementia as opposed to CTE. And so these are things like difficulty thinking, short-term memory loss. For example, there are a lot of stories of people that will be in their car and not know how to get home from 2 blocks away, or can never find their car keys, and this wasn't normal for them before. Difficulty planning or just carrying out normal tasks, being confused, and then again, as I mentioned, a progressive dementia that would normally occur decades later in life. Additionally, there may be motor problems and speech and language problems. So what's actually causing these symptoms? You have what are called tau protein tangles. And what happens is you have a normal healthy neuron or brain cell, and within them you have these little bundles called microtubules. Inside the microtubules, you have these little purple tau proteins. These tau proteins are stabilizing, they hold everything together. In a diseased neuron, as it degenerates or breaks down, the tubules start to fall apart and it releases these tau proteins. The tau proteins now clump, they get tangled, and these are called tau protein tangles. They get clumped in different parts of the brain, which we'll see in a minute. CTE can only be diagnosed right now through autopsy. They are working on different ways of diagnosing CTE in the living, but right now it's only able to be confirmed after death. What we're looking for are these tau protein clumps. So the examiner will take slices of brain, they will stain them with different chemicals that will make the tau protein clumps visible. It's mostly been found, as we've talked about, in retired NFL players, but it has been found in athletes that play other sports and also in younger athletes. Many athletes have pledged their brains to be studied after they die. They've donated their brains to science, specifically to a brain bank that's up in Boston, where most of the research is being done at Boston University. So they've pledged it so that they can then be studied. These are usually people who think they may have CTE while they're alive, but because it can't be confirmed, they want it to be confirmed after they die. When we look at the brain tissue, we can see on the left the normal brain tissue, and on the right, we can see these tau protein clumps that are stained. This again is looking at cross sections of the brain, so little slices of the brain. You can see in the earlier stages, there are 4 stages of CTE as of right now. It's just in little spots. Then it begins to migrate, get bigger clumps. The clumps are in more regions of the brain. Eventually, it becomes spread throughout the brain. And this is where we think we're starting to see different cognitive changes as well as the emotional mood behavior changes because of where within the brain they're located. In stage 4, the final stage, or the worst stages of CTE, you can see that they're diffuse, they're all over, and these tangles cover the brain in most regions. One more picture to look at. This is a normal brain. So you can see a normal brain is kind of plump, for lack of a better word. It has these nice, big, full sulci. You've got the bumps and the ridges, right? Or the valleys and the ridges. And so they're a lot fuller. When you have advanced CTE, this is the same cross section you can see highlighted in yellow where it should be, but instead it's much, much smaller because of the degenerative changes that have occurred. You can also see it's stained a lot darker because of those tau tangles. So just to finish up, CTE is caused by repetitive head trauma over a long period of time. It can only be diagnosed after death through observing the tau protein tangles, but there are a lot of emotional and cognitive changes that begin to occur in the late 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that can be indicative of CTE, which is why a lot of athletes are donating their brains to science to be studied later. And we being the scientific community, is working on ways to diagnose CTE before autopsy.